It was a beautiful morning, December 7th, 1941. Utter silence, no reason to worry, so the Americans thought. Around 8 a.m. that Sunday, a flock of Japanese aircrafts besieged the island. Nearly every warbird belonging to the United States was ablaze, never to be flown again. An impactful attack, yes, but that wasn't what the Japanese were after. Quickly the enemy reached their target. The American battleships were all damaged or capsized. 3 of the sunken ships were the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and the USS Utah. The intrusion killed 1,177 crewmen. 3 months later, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered all Americans of 1/16th or more Japanese ancestry to be imprisoned in internment camps. For 2.5 years, innocent citizens were stolen from their lives. Though America was afraid, Japanese internment should not have been acceptable. After the disturbance of that alone, interrupting their lives and imprisoning them for no good reason destroyed any success these people had. The Pearl Harbor bombing was the opposite of what the United States had anticipated. The attack at Pearl Harbor was the idea of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, who argued that it would give a fatal blow to the enemy fleet. The severity of this disaster left the current president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, wondering if something like this would happen again so suddenly. December 7th, 1941 would be known as a day of infamy. Against all morals and his wife's strong opinion, Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. This was the order allowing the imprisonment of Japanese persons to be legal. It would go into effect immediately. No, Roosevelt was not happy with his decision, but it was a time of national crisis, and he believed this was the only option. Soon enough, posters warning of relocation of anyone of Japanese ancestry were taped on every main street in the United States. Not much later, FBI was aggressively knocking on doors and forcing Japanese citizens into buses to the nearest camp or relocation center. Everything belonging to the prisoners were confiscated and properly disposed of, keeping nothing but what they could carry. Of course, the children were shown no different treatment. Around 17,000 kids under the age of 10 were locked up as well. By the time all the Japanese Americans were rounded up, over 100,000 were in confinement. Of those, less than 250 were spying for Japan. 99.99% of the citizens that were jailed were innocent. Internment was one of the worst experiences in these people's lifetimes, and for what? Less than 1% of the Japanese Americans were spying for Japan, so they had no reason being there. For days, Japanese Americans were stuck on buses and trains, trying to reach the nearest relocation center for monitored temporary housing, a few months at most. Unfortunately, unfit for human living. These centers were located in remote areas, often reconfigured fairgrounds and racetracks with buildings not meant for human habitation. Conditions included thousands of people sleeping in horse stalls or cow sheds. There always seemed to be food shortages and substandard sanitation. Eventually, everyone would be hauled into the easiest mode of transportation, headed to an internment camp. These were no party either. Converted racetracks and barbed wire fences was nothing less than a nightmare. Bullets stormed down like hail from guard towers for simply getting too close to the fencing. Men and women being shot and killed for no good reason. Tear gas was thrown at crowds by police forces, causing commotion and multiple reported deaths. From the start, violence and discomfort was given to prisoners. To make matters worse, there was a crowding issue everywhere. In the provided homes, multiple families were expected to live in one room, barely enough space for 3 people to live comfortably. The rooms had little to no insulation for cold weather, and poor ventilation in the heat. Typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox spread across the camp in no time. Next, there were the dining halls. Too many people cramped in at the same time. To eat, there were no options. You got rice, vegetables, and bread day after day. Even if these things sound appealing, they certainly were not. The portions were not filling and popularly described as disgusting. Food poisoning and other similar illnesses resulted this. Most adult internees were given the opportunity to work. There was a significant range of jobs, from doctoring, cooking or serving, working in construction, or even being a janitor. There was a job for almost anyone. Yes, this was a good thing, except the Japanese were only paid a fraction of what a Caucasian would be paid. For example, say a Caucasian is paid $2,000 a year. A Japanese American in internment would be paid around $250 for the year. Everything about the camps were unfair, and someone needed to put a stop to it. In 1942, 22-year-old Fred Korematsu refused to participate in the camps. He was arrested and sent to the San Francisco County Jail. 4 months later, he was convicted of defying a government order. Korematsu was persistent. He appealed his case until he got to the Supreme Court. The first time around, the court ruled against him. After World War II ended, the Japanese Americans were freed, maybe from the camps, but not from the racism following their return to American society. For years, they lived uncomfortably. Korematsu kept his innocence, however his U.S. Supreme Court conviction had an impact on his professional life. In 1983, Korematsu's case was reopened by pro bono attorneys. After being offered a pardon by the U.S. Justice Department, a close member of his family claimed that Fred was not interested in a pardon from the government. Instead, he always felt that it was the government who should seek a pardon from him and from Japanese Americans for the wrong that was committed. Later in the year, Korematsu's conviction was overturned. Even then, he wanted the government to admit that they were wrong. He fought for the government's word to never allow this to happen to any American citizen, no matter their race, creed, or color. He decided to become an active member of the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations, as well as human rights activist. He traveled to Washington, D.C., and helped process the official apology from the government to all of the surviving Japanese Americans that were in internment. Starting in 1988, President Reagan signed a Civil Liberties Act, which compensated over 100,000 people that were incarcerated in Japanese internment camps. This was a formal apology and $20,000 to every surviving victim. Internment was at this time described as a grave injustice, the money acting as a redress for their experiences. When Korematsu first went to court back in the 1940s, he wanted to receive proper justice. He did not want to wait 40 years for everyone to get their apology. In the end, he got what he asked for. Yet the experience of internment can never be forgotten. You can never take the awful memories from over 100,000 people. Nothing could ever make it right, not even the extreme amount of sympathy money meant to compensate for hurting lives. Studies showed that the internees had a much greater risk of cardiovascular disease and traumatic stress. The younger ones lived with low self-esteem and psychological trauma, making them feel like they were worthless because they were born with their culture, which is not the case at all. The American government was wrong, which they did admit, but in an untimely fashion. Japanese internment was an impactful and awful tragedy. Thankfully, there is meaning to the event. All the arguing for fairness and equal rights assures the triumphant statement that nothing like this should ever happen again, at least not without putting up a fight.